In 1929, a group of scholars were cataloguing the contents of the Topkapi Palace Library in Istanbul. It was routine archival work, the kind of slow, careful documentation that happens in great old institutions when someone finally decides to properly organise what has been sitting in storage for centuries. Most of what they found was exactly what you would expect: administrative records, religious texts, correspondence, the accumulated paper of an empire. Then they found the map. It was drawn on a fragment of gazelle skin. The parchment was old enough that the scholars immediately understood they were looking at something significant. When they examined it more closely, they found a date and a signature. The map had been drawn in the year 1513 by an Ottoman admiral and cartographer named Reis. That much was unremarkable. The 16th century produced many maps. What was not unremarkable, what was in fact so far outside the expected that the scholars spent years arguing about what they were actually looking at, was what the map showed. Along the bottom edge, below the coastlines of South America and Africa, below the islands of the Atlantic, there was another landmass. A coastline, a continuous line of coast with bays and inlets, and a geographical specificity that suggested it had been drawn from observation, or from a source that had been drawn from observation. Not guesswork, not the conventional practice of filling in unknown regions with monsters and vague shapes. A specific, detailed coastline. The problem was what coastline it was. When researchers compared the bottom edge of the Reis map to modern cartography, they found a match. Not a perfect match. Not a match that eliminated all doubt, but a match that has never been fully explained away. The coastline along the bottom of the 1513 map corresponds in its general geography to the coastline of Antarctica, the continent that was not officially discovered until 1820. The continent that, in 1513, no European, no Ottoman, no person in the historical record had ever seen. The continent that today is covered under an ice sheet that, in most places, is between 1 and 4 kilometers thick. And here is the specific detail that makes the Reis map not just anomalous, but genuinely disturbing to certain categories of assumption. The coastline depicted does not show Antarctica as it appears today under the ice. It shows what Antarctica looks like underneath the ice, the subglacial topography, the actual rock surface of the continent as revealed by modern sonar and seismic surveys conducted centuries after the map was drawn. The rivers and bays and inlets visible on the Reis map correspond not to the current ice-covered surface of Antarctica, but to the land surface beneath it. That should not be possible, and yet the map exists. It is in the Topkapi Palace Museum. You can see it. You can have it examined by cartographers and historians and geologists and every category of expert you can think of, and they will tell you the same thing. The map exists. The correspondence to subglacial Antarctic topography is real. And the explanation for how it got there is one of the most contested and fascinating questions in the study of ancient history. Tonight we're going to go into that question. Not to give you a clean answer, because there is no clean answer, but to give you the honest complexity of what the evidence actually shows, what the different interpretations are, what each of them can and cannot explain, and what the entire body of evidence suggests about the depth and the gaps in our understanding of human prehistory. Because the Reis map is not alone. It is part of a pattern of ancient maps, ancient texts, ancient structures and ancient genetic signals that, when you look at them together rather than in isolation, begin to suggest something extraordinary, something that the standard historical narrative has not fully accommodated, something that the scientific community is still, slowly and reluctantly, and with appropriate skepticism, beginning to take more seriously than it did 20 years ago. The story starts with a man named Plato, and it starts much earlier than the map. Plato was not writing science fiction. That needs to be said clearly at the outset, because the standard dismissal of the Atlantis story is that it was a literary invention, a philosophical allegory, a cautionary tale that Plato constructed to make a point about hubris and divine punishment. And that dismissal is not without merit. Plato was absolutely capable of constructing elaborate fictional scenarios to make philosophical points. He did it repeatedly. The allegory of the cave, the ring of Gyges, the myth of Plato used made-up stories to illustrate real ideas. This is not in dispute. But the Atlantis account is different from those other Platonic fictions in several specific ways that matter for evaluating its credibility as a historical source. The first difference is the sourcing. In the dialogues Timaeus and Critias, written around 350 years before the birth of Christ, Plato does not present Atlantis as a story he invented. He presents it explicitly and in considerable detail as a historical account transmitted to Greece from Egypt. The transmission chain he describes is specific. The Athenian statesman Solon travelled to Egypt in the 6th century BC. In Egypt, at the city of Sais, Solon spoke with priests who had access to ancient records. The priests told Solon about events that had occurred 9,000 years before their own time. Solon recorded this account, and through a chain of transmission that Plato describes in detail, the account reached Plato. 9,000 years before Solon's time in Egypt, around 9,600 BC. That is an extraordinarily specific date, and it is the same date within the margin of geological reckoning as the end of the Younger Dryas, as the period we discussed at length in a previous exploration when the global human population collapsed by up to 90%, when sea levels rose dramatically, when the great megafauna went extinct, and when the survivors built Göbekli Tepe on a hilltop in Turkey as the first surviving monument of the post-catastrophe world. Plato does not just give a date, he gives a description. Atlantis, according to his account, was an island civilization of extraordinary sophistication, located in the Atlantic Ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is what the ancient Greeks called the Strait of Gibraltar. It was larger than Libya and Asia combined, which is either a dramatic exaggeration or a description of something much larger than an island in any conventional sense. It was a naval power. It had complex urban infrastructure, with concentric rings of water and land around a central hill, with harbours and bridges and channels and elaborate buildings. Its people were advanced. They traded across the known world, and then, according to Plato, in a single day and night of catastrophe, it sank beneath the ocean. The second difference between the Atlantis account and Plato's acknowledged fictions is the level of geographical and physical specificity. The description of Atlantis in the Critias is not philosophical allegory. It is civil engineering. Plato describes specific dimensions for the rings of water and land, specific materials used in construction, specific agricultural arrangements outside the city, specific harbour configurations. This level of technical specificity is not characteristic of Plato's philosophical myths, which tend to be evocative rather than precise. The Atlantis description reads like someone trying to record what they were told, not someone constructing a teaching tool. The third difference is that Plato stakes the account's credibility on the Egyptian records explicitly, and describes his informant, Critias, as frustrated when people dismiss the story as fiction. In the Timaeus, Critias specifically says that Solon would have been as famous as any Greek poet if he had completed his rendering of the Egyptian account into verse, but that the pressures of Athenian political life prevented him from doing so. This is not the framing of a fictional invention. This is the framing of someone transmitting what they believe to be history. Does this prove Plato was accurately reporting real historical events? No. Sources can be wrong. Memory can be corrupted. Transmission chains can introduce errors. And 9,000 years of oral tradition before the Egyptian priests recorded it is an enormous span of time during which the original account could have been transformed beyond recognition. But it establishes something important. Plato believed he was reporting something real. The fictional allegory dismissal does not fit the text as well as its proponents suggest. So what was Atlantis? Where was it? What happened to it? And why does a Turkish admiral's map drawn in 1513 show a coastline that should not have been known to anyone at that time? Those questions do not have unanimous answers. But the range of answers that serious researchers have proposed, and the evidence that each of them can point to, is far more interesting than either credulous belief or dismissive skepticism. Let's start with the map problem, because the Piri race map is not the only anomalous ancient map. It is the most famous. But once you start looking, the pattern extends further than most people realize. Piri race himself, in notes written in the margins of the map, tells us where he got his source material. He was not working from his own observations, he was compiling. He had access to approximately 20 source maps, some of which he describes as being from the time of Alexander the Great, which would place them in the 4th century BC. Others he describes as even older, Arab sources, Indian sources, maps whose own provenance he does not fully know. He assembled them into a composite picture of the world as he understood it. This is significant. It means the information on the Piri race map is not necessarily reflecting knowledge current in 1513. It may be reflecting knowledge from much older sources that Piri race was copying, and if those sources themselves were copying from even older sources, the actual origin of the information could be pushed back considerably further. The Oronce Finé map of 1531 is the next anomalous document. Phineas was a French cartographer who published a world map in which he depicted a southern continent, which he labelled Terra Australis, that corresponds in its general geography to Antarctica. Like the Piri race map, the Phineas depiction shows a continent whose coastline approximates the subglacial topography of Antarctica more closely than the ice-covered surface visible today. It shows rivers flowing from an interior that, under today's ice sheet, does contain river valleys. It shows bays and inlets that correspond to subglacial features. The Phineas map also shows, crucially, that the interior of the southern continent is ice-free in the coastal regions, but has what appears to be an ice cap in the central areas. This is not the Antarctica of today, which is uniformly covered in ice. It is the Antarctica of approximately 6,000 years ago, when the ice sheet was smaller and the coastal regions were partially free of ice. An Antarctica that no person in the 16th century had any documented means of knowing about. Then there is the Boiche map of 1737. Philippe Boiche was a French geographer who published a map of the southern polar region based on what he described as much older source material. The Boiche map is perhaps the most extraordinary of the three because it shows Antarctica not as a single continent, but as two separate land masses divided by a seaway running through the centre of the polar region. This is precisely the subglacial topography of Antarctica, as revealed by modern ice-penetrating radar surveys. Below the ice, Antarctica is indeed two separate land masses divided by a channel. This was not known from direct observation until the 20th century. How did Boache know? His answer was his source maps. He was working from documents he believed to be ancient. He did not claim personal knowledge. He was, like Piri Reis, compiling from older sources of unknown ultimate origin. The standard explanation for all three maps is that they represent coincidental resemblances, confirmation bias on the part of researchers who are looking for patterns that are not really there, and the universal human tendency to fill in unknown spaces with plausible-looking geography. The coastlines are close enough to real geography that people who want to see a match see one, but not close enough to actually require an extraordinary explanation. This explanation is not unreasonable. Cartographers did fill in unknowns. Ancient maps are full of fabricated coastlines, and the resemblances between the ancient maps and actual Antarctic topography, while real, are not perfect. There are significant discrepancies, bays that do not line up correctly, proportions that are wrong, features that appear where they should not be. But the dismissal is also not fully satisfying. The discrepancies are the kind of discrepancies you would expect from maps that were imperfectly copied through multiple generations of transmission. The matches are the kind of matches that would require an extraordinary explanation if they are real matches, and the specific detail of the subglacial versus surface topography, the fact that the maps show what is under the ice rather than what is on top of it, is the detail that most resist the coincidence explanation. If someone fabricated a coastline for the southern polar region, they would have no particular reason to fabricate one that matches the subglacial topography rather than any other arbitrary shape. The probability that a fabricated coastline would happen to match the real shape of the land under the ice, a shape that was not known until the 20th century, is not zero, but it is low enough to be uncomfortable. The map anomalies are not proof of anything, but they are evidence of something, evidence that requires an explanation, and the most coherent explanation available, though not the only one, is that the maps reflect genuine geographical knowledge that was generated by someone who had access to Antarctica before the ice reached its current extent, before approximately 12,000 years ago, before the Younger Dryas. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what Antarctica was like before the ice, and to understand that, you need to understand the ice itself. The Antarctic ice sheet is not a permanent fixture of the planet. Like all ice sheets, it has grown and contracted through geological time in response to changes in global temperature, ocean circulation, and atmospheric chemistry. During the height of the last ice age, the Antarctic ice sheet was actually somewhat larger than it is today, extended by the same global cooling that drove the growth of the Northern Hemisphere ice sheets. But before the last ice age, during the warm interglacial periods, the Antarctic ice sheet was smaller, possibly dramatically smaller. The geological and paleoclimate evidence for what Antarctica looked like during these warmer periods is incomplete and contested. The difficulty is access. The interior of Antarctica is buried under kilometers of ice, and the coastal regions are covered by glaciers that make direct geological survey of the underlying rock extremely difficult. What we know comes from ice cores, from seismic surveys, from the limited exposures of rock along the coast and on offshore islands, and from models of how the ice sheet responds to changing climate. What the evidence suggests is that during periods of significant warming, particularly during the interglacial periods that preceded the most recent ice age. The Antarctic ice sheet was reduced enough that significant coastal regions would have been ice-free. Not the entire continent, but the margins, the coastal regions, the same regions that the Oronce and Phineas and Boache maps appear to depict. The most recent period during which Antarctic coastal regions would have been significantly ice-free was approximately 15,000 to 12,000 years ago, during the period of rapid deglaciation that preceded the Younger Dryas. As the global temperature rose following the last glacial maximum, ice melted across the northern hemisphere but also in Antarctica. Sea levels rose, and the coastal margins of Antarctica became, if the models are correct, substantially more ice-free than they are today. Then the Younger Dryas hit. The temperature plunged. The ice advanced again, and when the Younger Dryas ended and the Holocene warming resumed, the Antarctic ice sheet began a slow, erratic process of expansion and contraction that continues to this day, but with the coastal ice generally more extensive than it had been during the deglaciation peak. If there was a coastal civilization in Antarctica during the deglaciation period, roughly 15,000 to 12,000 years ago, it would have been operating in a window of habitability that opened and then closed, a window during which the coastal regions had liquid water, exposed land, and given the warmer global temperatures of that period, potentially a climate that was cold but not impossibly so, not tropical Antarctica, but not the permanent deep freeze of today either. And then the Younger Dryas arrived. In the space of a few years or decades, the climate shifted, the temperatures dropped, the ice advanced. Whatever was on those coastal margins was buried under the growing ice sheet that has persisted in some form to this day. This is the physical mechanism by which a coastal Antarctic civilization could have existed and then been entirely erased without leaving accessible archaeological evidence. The evidence would be under the ice, under 1 to 4 kilometers of ice in most places, beyond the reach of any current archaeological investigation, and likely beyond the reach of any investigation that will be possible in the foreseeable future. This is not a comfortable argument for archaeologists because it puts the evidence permanently out of reach. But it is not on that basis alone wrong. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence when the place where the evidence would be found is buried under kilometers of ice. There is a researcher named Charles Hapgood who matters to this story, and whose legacy is complicated in a way that is itself instructive about how extraordinary claims get received by the scientific community. Hapgood was an American academic, a professor at Keene State College in New Hampshire, who in 1958 published a book called Earth's Shifting Crust. The book proposed a mechanism he called crustal displacement, the idea that the lithosphere of the Earth, the outer crust, could periodically shift as a unit relative to the underlying mantle. A shift of this kind would move entire continents relative to the poles, changing which regions experience polar conditions and which experience temperate or tropical conditions, without requiring the gradual processes of plate tectonics. Hapgood proposed that the most recent such displacement had moved Antarctica from a position further north, where it had been partially temperate, to its current polar position. This displacement, he argued, occurred approximately 12,000 years ago. It explained the frozen mammoths of Siberia, which appeared to have died suddenly in conditions of rapid freezing. It explained the anomalous ancient maps. It explained the Atlantis story. And it explained the widespread flood myths as the result of the massive sea level disruption caused by the crustal shift. Albert Einstein, who was still alive when Hapgood was developing his ideas, wrote a foreword to an early version of Hapgood's manuscript, in which he expressed genuine interest in the hypothesis and suggested it deserved serious investigation. Einstein did not endorse the hypothesis as correct, but he thought it was the kind of idea that should be investigated rather than dismissed. The scientific community was less enthusiastic. Crustal displacement, as Hapgood described it, was not compatible with what was then known about the physics of the Earth's crust and mantle. The mechanism required the lithosphere to move in ways that the geological evidence did not support. And as the theory of plate tectonics developed and became established in the 1960s and 70s, Hapgood's model became increasingly incompatible with the dominant paradigm of how the Earth's crust behaves. Today, crustal displacement in Hapgood's original form is not accepted by the geological mainstream. The mechanism does not work as he described it. But Hapgood's broader project, his compilation and analysis of anomalous ancient maps, his argument that the map suggested knowledge of Antarctica before its official discovery, remains genuinely interesting even to researchers who reject his proposed mechanism. The maps are real. The anomalies are real. The question of how the information got into them is still open. The dismissal of Hapgood is sometimes used to dismiss the entire question of anomalous ancient maps and pre-conventional knowledge of polar geography. This is a logical error. Hapgood's proposed mechanism may be wrong without the maps being explicable. The map anomalies are a different problem from the mechanism that would explain them. You can reject crustal displacement as the explanation, while still acknowledging that the maps require some explanation. What is that explanation? Nobody knows for certain, which is exactly where we need to be honest. If you are using this to fall asleep, that is exactly what these videos are for. Let me know in the comments where you are in the world and what time it is there. I always read them. Some of my favourite comments come from people in places I would never have expected. And then let's keep going, because we have only just started. Let us talk about Graham Hancock. Because you cannot discuss Atlantis in the contemporary context without discussing Graham Hancock. And because the way his work has been received illustrates something important about how the establishment of knowledge works and where its boundaries are. Hancock is a British journalist and author who has spent 3 decades arguing, in books, in lectures, and more recently in a documentary series, that there was a sophisticated civilization before the conventional timeline of civilization. A civilization that existed prior to 12,000 years ago that was destroyed in the catastrophic events at the end of the last ice age, and whose survivors carried its knowledge to the populations of the world that followed, seeding what would become the great civilizations of Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, and the Americas. His most famous book, Fingerprints of the Gods, published in 1995, is a synthesis of the anomalous ancient maps, the Plato account, the Younger Dryas catastrophe, the megafauna extinctions, the Sphinx and its apparent water erosion suggesting a date much older than Egyptologists assign it, the alignments of ancient monuments to astronomical configurations that existed at earlier dates than the monuments are conventionally dated to, and the global flood myths. Taken individually, he argues, each anomaly has a conventional explanation that is somewhat unsatisfying. Taken together, they point to something the conventional narrative has not yet accommodated. The scientific and archaeological establishment has treated Hancock's work with a combination of hostility, condescension, and occasional grudging acknowledgement. The hostility comes from the perception that he is promoting pseudoscience, that he cherry-picks evidence, that he presents speculation as established fact, that his work undermines public understanding of genuine archaeology by providing an exciting alternative narrative that does not require the hard work of actual evidence evaluation. Some of these criticisms are valid. Hancock does overstate his case in places. He presents correlations as causal connections. He treats the absence of evidence as insufficient disproof, rather than as a legitimate reason for skepticism. He writes with rhetorical power that can carry readers past epistemic gaps that should give them pause. But some of the dismissal is also, on honest examination, driven by something other than pure adherence to evidence. The conventional archaeological narrative has its own investments, its own established timelines that have shaped careers and institutions, its own discomfort with the idea that there might be something significant that it has missed. And when a journalist with no academic credentials argues that the entire framework of conventional archaeology is missing a major chapter, the response is not always purely evidential. The most honest position is this: Hancock identifies real anomalies, the anomalous maps, the Plato account, the correspondences between ancient monuments and astronomical configurations, the genetic evidence of coastal population movements, the flood myths. These anomalies exist independently of Hancock's interpretation of them. His interpretation may be wrong. A lost civilization of the kind he describes may not exist, but the anomalies that motivated his interpretation are real, and they deserve better treatment than blanket dismissal. The question is whether the anomalies, taken together, actually require an explanation as dramatic as a pre-conventional civilization, or whether they can be individually explained within the conventional framework without invoking something extraordinary. Let us look at the evidence one category at a time. The geological evidence first, because it is the most solid and because it is the category where mainstream science has most substantially updated its position in recent years. We know that sea levels were approximately 120 meters lower during the last glacial maximum than they are today. We know that the rise from that level to current sea levels occurred primarily between approximately 18,000 and 7,000 years ago, with particularly rapid phases of rise associated with the melting of major ice sheets. We know that during this period, enormous areas of continental shelf, coastal plain, and river delta that had been dry land for tens of thousands of years were drowned by the rising ocean. These drowned landscapes are not hypothetical, they are real. They can be studied using underwater archaeology, sonar mapping, and sediment core analysis, and they were inhabited. The coastal migration routes that humans followed as they spread around the world during the late Pleistocene ran across land that is now underwater. The ancient shorelines of every inhabited continent are now submerged, in most cases by dozens to over 100 meters of water. The coastal hypothesis, the idea that the most sophisticated and densely populated pre-agricultural human societies were coastal societies, whose evidence is now drowned, is not fringe archaeology. It is a mainstream and increasingly accepted framework for understanding why the archaeological record of the late Pleistocene seems so sparse relative to what the genetic evidence suggests about population size and distribution. The people were there, their settlements were on the coasts are underwater. What this means is that the conventional archaeological record derived primarily from inland sites that were above sea level during the Pleistocene systematically underrepresents the sophistication and distribution of human culture before 10,000 years ago. This is not a controversial claim. It is the implication of well-established geology and demography. What is more controversial is how much it underrepresents. Whether the missing coastal evidence would merely fill in the picture we already have, or whether it would transform it. The genetic evidence is the second category, and it has become much more interesting in the last decade as ancient DNA analysis has transformed our understanding of prehistoric population movements. Ancient DNA studies of Pleistocene and early Holocene human populations have revealed a picture that is considerably more complex than the conventional narrative of gradual population expansion from Africa. There are genetic signals in modern human populations that suggest long-distance maritime contacts at dates much earlier than the conventional history of seafaring allows for. There are population relationships between geographically distant groups that are hard to explain without positing sea crossings that the conventional narrative would not have predicted. The peopling of the Americas is one example. The conventional model had humans crossing the Bering land bridge from Asia, approximately 15,000 years ago, and spreading southward through an ice-free corridor between the retreating ice sheets. But the genetic evidence from South American populations and the archaeological evidence from sites like Monteverde in Chile, which dates to approximately 14,500 years ago with possible earlier occupation, suggest that people were in South America at dates that are difficult to reconcile with the ice-free corridor model. They may have come by boat, along the Pacific coast, following the Kelp Highway, as some researchers call it, or by other maritime routes that the conventional framework had not anticipated. The Denisovan genetic signal in certain Pacific island populations, particularly in the Philippines and in New Guinea and Aboriginal Australians, represents another puzzling pattern. The Denisovans appear to have been in Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. Their genetic legacy is present in populations on islands that required maritime crossings to reach. This implies that someone, Denisovans or people who interbred with Denisovans, was capable of open water navigation at dates far earlier than the conventional history of seafaring. These genetic signals do not prove the existence of a pre-conventional civilization. They do suggest that human maritime capability in the late Pleistocene was more developed than the conventional framework has assumed. And that matters for evaluating whether the anomalous maps could reflect genuine knowledge generated by maritime societies that existed before the conventional record begins. The third category is the structural evidence. The ancient monuments whose alignments, whose ages or whose construction techniques suggest knowledge that the conventional framework has difficulty accommodating. The Sphinx is the most famous example. The conventional dating of the Sphinx places its construction in the reign of the pharaoh Khafra, approximately 4,500 years ago. This dating is based primarily on stylistic and contextual grounds. The Sphinx is located in the same complex as Khafra's pyramid and his valley temple. The damaged stele found between the Sphinx's paws, called the Dream Stele, appears to name Khafra in a context that some scholars interpret as indicating he built the monument. But the geologist Robert Schoch, a professor at Boston University, published a peer-reviewed analysis in 1992, arguing that the weathering pattern on the body of the Sphinx and on the walls of the Sphinx enclosure is not consistent with wind and sand erosion, which is the expected pattern for a monument in the Egyptian desert. The weathering is consistent with rainfall erosion, and the kind of heavy rainfall required to produce the weathering visible on the Sphinx did not fall on the Giza Plateau after approximately 7,000 to 5,000 BC. Before that date, During the African humid period when the Sahara was green, the rainfall was sufficient. This implies, if Schoch's analysis is correct, that the Sphinx was carved and exposed to rainfall at a date between 7000 and 5000 BC at the earliest, and possibly earlier. That would make it between 2000 and 4000 years older than the conventional dating. Perhaps older still. Schoch's analysis has been disputed. Other geologists have argued that the weathering pattern can be explained by other mechanisms that do not require great age. The debate continues, but Schoch is not a fringe figure. He is a credentialed geologist at a serious institution, publishing in peer-reviewed venues, making a specific technical argument about rock weathering that can be evaluated on its merits. The dismissal of his work has sometimes been less rigorous than his work itself. Göbekli Tepe is in this category too, though it is now fully accepted by mainstream archaeology rather than disputed. The existence of Göbekli Tepe, a sophisticated monumental structure built by hunter-gatherers 11,500 years ago, has already required a significant revision of the conventional timeline. The conventional view was that civilization, meaning complex architecture, social organization sufficient for large projects, and symbolic culture sophisticated enough to produce elaborate carvings, required agriculture. Göbekli Tepe proves that view wrong. Hunter-gatherers built it. Before agriculture, before cities, before the conventional timeline of civilization begins. If hunter-gatherers could build Göbekli Tepe, what else could they have built? What was the ceiling of late Pleistocene human capability? The answer, demonstrated by Göbekli Tepe, is higher than the conventional framework assumed, not infinitely higher. Not necessarily high enough to include globe-spanning navigation and sophisticated cartography, but higher, and the people who built Göbekli Tepe had to have come from somewhere. They had to have existed in a social context that enabled the coordination of the labour, the transmission of the knowledge required for the construction, and the shared cultural system that gave the monument its meaning. That context was the late Pleistocene hunter-gatherer world that preceded the Younger Dryas, the world that was largely destroyed by the catastrophe, the world that, in the archaeological record, is severely underrepresented because so much of it was coastal and is now underwater. Let us talk about the astronomical alignments, because this is perhaps the category of evidence that is simultaneously the most compelling to a general audience and the most technically difficult to evaluate. The argument, developed by several researchers including Hancock himself and the Belgian engineer Robert Bauval, is that certain ancient monuments are aligned not to astronomical configurations that existed at the time of their conventional construction dates, but are configurations that existed much earlier. If this is true, it implies either that the monuments are much older than conventionally dated, or that their builders had astronomical knowledge transmitted from a much older tradition that recorded the sky as it appeared at a significantly earlier date. The most famous version of this argument concerns the three great pyramids of Giza and their alignment to the three belt stars of the constellation Orion. Bauval published the observation in 1994 that the three Giza pyramids, their relative positions and sizes, match the three belt stars of Orion with considerable precision. The Nile corresponds to the Milky Way. The overall layout of the Giza complex maps onto the sky in a specific orientation, and the specific orientation does not correspond to the sky as it looked 4,500 years ago when the pyramids were conventionally dated. It corresponds to the sky as it looked approximately 10,500 years ago. This is because the Earth's axis wobbles in a process called precession, completing one full wobble approximately every 26,000 years. As a result of this wobble, the positions of the stars relative to the horizon change slowly over time. The stars that are currently visible in the northern sky are different from the stars that were visible 12,000 years ago, and the orientation of the Orion's belt asterism relative to the meridian was different 12,000 years ago from what it was 4,500 years ago. Bouval's correlation, called the Orion correlation theory, has been disputed extensively. Critics have pointed out that the match between the pyramids and the belt stars, while real at a general level, is not as precise as claimed when examined in detail. The southernmost pyramid is slightly offset from the position the theory predicts. The argument requires cherry-picking which features to compare and which to ignore, and the astronomical event of precession is gradual enough that many different dates could produce a reasonable match, making the specificity of the 10,500 BC claim questionable. These criticisms are valid to varying degrees. The Orion correlation theory is not established science. It is a hypothesis with suggestive but not conclusive evidence. But the dismissal of it as obviously wrong is also not entirely warranted. The general alignment exists. The precession of the equinoxes is a real phenomenon. The question of whether the alignment encodes knowledge of an earlier astronomical configuration is a legitimate question, even if the current evidence does not definitively answer it. What is more broadly interesting than any single monument's alignment is the global pattern. Across the world, ancient monuments show sophisticated astronomical knowledge. The Great Pyramid's alignment to true north is accurate to within 1/20th of a degree, which is more precise than the Paris Observatory at the time it was built. Stonehenge's alignment to the midsummer sunrise and the midwinter sunset is precisely engineered. The temples of Malta, which are among the oldest freestanding stone structures in the world, are aligned to the rising positions of specific stars and to the solstices. The Mayan observatories and temples are aligned with great precision to astronomical events. Angkor Wat in Cambodia maps the positions of the stars in the constellation Draco as they appeared at the spring equinox approximately 10,500 years ago. The convergence of astronomical sophistication across cultures and time periods that had no documented contact with each other raises a genuine question. Was this astronomical knowledge independently developed multiple times, or was it transmitted from a common source whose own origins predate the conventional record? Neither answer is inherently impossible. Independent, parallel development is a real phenomenon in human intellectual history. Calculus was independently developed by Newton and Leibniz. Writing was independently invented in multiple locations. Sophisticated astronomy could have been independently developed multiple times, but the specific correspondences, the specific astronomical events and orientations that recur across widely separated ancient monuments are curious enough to require some explanation, and the explanation that they represent a common tradition transmitted from a pre-conventional source is not inherently less plausible than the explanation that they represent entirely independent parallel development. Now let's go underwater, because the most direct physical evidence relevant to the lost civilization question is not in the ancient texts, not in the maps, not in the astronomical alignments of monuments on dry land. It is at the bottom of the ocean, and it is only recently, with the development of advanced sonar mapping and underwater archaeology, that we have begun to seriously investigate what is down there. The Yonaguni Monument is perhaps the most dramatic underwater structure yet discovered in the context of this question. Located off the southern tip of Yonaguni Island in Japan, at depths between 5 and 30 meters, the Yonaguni Monument consists of a series of massive stone terraces, ramps, staircases, and what appear to be carved features. The largest structure is approximately 66 meters long, 27 meters wide, and 27 meters tall. It is clearly made of rock. What is not clear is whether the specific geometry of the structure reflects natural geological processes or human modification. Japanese geologists and archaeologists have taken opposing positions on this question. Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist at the University of the Ryukyus, has argued in numerous publications that the Yonaguni Monument is an artificial structure, a terraced platform of human construction, and that its features, including what he identifies as carved staircases, pillars, a road, and a face, are incompatible with natural geological formation. Robert Schopp, the same geologist who analysed the Sphinx weathering, has examined the Yonaguni Monument in person and concluded that it is primarily natural, a product of the specific geological properties of the local sandstone, which tends to fracture along straight lines and right angles. He does not entirely rule out human modification of a natural formation, but does not see evidence of construction. The significance of the Yonaguni Monument to the Atlantis question is the dating. The site is now submerged. It was above sea level during the last ice age, when sea levels were significantly lower. The last time the Yonaguni area was above water, if the structure is artificial, it would have been constructed before the sea level rise that drowned it. Based on the depth of submersion, this would place construction before approximately 10,000 years ago. Before the conventional record of Japanese civilization, the Bimini Road is the Western Hemisphere's equivalent. Located off the coast of North Bimini Island in the Bahamas, at a depth of approximately 5 to 8 meters, the Bimini Road is a formation of large flat limestone blocks arranged in a curving line approximately 800 meters long. The blocks are remarkably regular in shape, and the regularity has led some researchers to argue that the formation is an ancient road or wall of human construction. Geologists have generally argued that the blocks are beach rock, a naturally occurring formation created when carbonate sediments cemented together in the intertidal zone, and that the regular shape of the blocks reflects natural fracturing patterns rather than human shaping. The controversy has not been resolved, partly because beach rock can form in ways that superficially resemble cut stone, and partly because actual cut stone can be dismissed as beach rock by researchers who begin with the assumption that no human structure of that age could exist in that location. This circular reasoning is difficult to escape. If you assume pre-conventional seafaring civilization is impossible, you will interpret ambiguous evidence as natural. If you assume it is possible, you will interpret the same evidence as potentially artificial. More recently, and with rather better evidence, sonar surveys have begun revealing structures on continental shelves around the world that are less ambiguous in their artificiality. Off the coast of India, in the Gulf of Kambat, sonar surveys conducted in the early 2000s revealed what appears to be a planned urban settlement on the ocean floor, at depths suggesting it was drowned by rising sea levels approximately 9,000 years ago. The structures, if they are structures, include what appear to be walls, streets, and a large rectangular feature that could be a building. Artifacts dredged from the area, including wood, pottery, and stone tools, have been dated to approximately 9,000 years ago. The Indian government's investigation of the site was inconclusive, complicated by the turbid waters and strong currents that make visibility and investigation difficult. Mainstream archaeology has not accepted the interpretation of the sonar features as the ruins of an ancient city, but neither has it definitively ruled it out. Off the coast of Cuba in the late 1990s, a Canadian company conducting sonar surveys for pipeline routing detected regular geometric shapes on the ocean floor at a depth of approximately 600 to 700 meters. These shapes were consistent with the ruins of structures, roads, and buildings arranged in a planned pattern. Subsequent investigation using remotely operated vehicles provided images that some researchers interpreted as showing large granite blocks in regular arrangements. The Cuban government conducted its own investigation, which produced inconclusive results. The site has not been investigated with the kind of comprehensive scientific effort that would be required to definitively establish or refute the presence of artificial structures. The deep water around the Cuban site is problematic for the lost civilization hypothesis, because 600 to 700 meters of water depth corresponds to sea levels not seen since approximately 12,000 years ago in the Cuban region. Whatever is down there, if anything is down there, would have been above water during the Younger Dryas and the period immediately preceding it. None of these underwater sites constitute definitive evidence of a pre-conventional civilization. Each of them has a conventional explanation that does not require anything extraordinary. But collectively they suggest that the ocean floor around the world has not been adequately investigated, that there may be structures down there of human origin that predate the conventional timeline, and that the apparent absence of such structures in the archaeological record is partly an artifact of where archaeologists have been looking, rather than evidence that no such structures exist. Let's step back from the evidence for a moment and think about what a pre-conventional civilization would actually have looked like, what it would have needed to be, what it could and could not have been. The lost civilization hypothesis, in its most credible form, does not require a civilization that was technologically superior to modern civilization. It does not require electricity, metalworking beyond what is possible with late Pleistocene techniques, or any technology that would leave obvious traces in the geological record. What it requires is a civilization sophisticated enough to be a meaningful source of the knowledge that appears, anomalously, in later cultures, specifically astronomical knowledge, cartographic knowledge, including knowledge of the Earth's spherical geometry and the methods for projecting it onto flat maps, maritime knowledge, including the ability to navigate open ocean, and perhaps architectural knowledge, including the methods for large-scale stone construction and astronomical alignment. All of these forms of knowledge are possible for a society at a late Paleolithic or early Mesolithic technological level. Sophisticated astronomical observation does not require telescopes or metal instruments. It requires systematic observation over long periods, good memory or record-keeping systems, and mathematical understanding of the patterns that emerge from observation. That mathematical understanding does not require writing or calculation tools we would recognize. It can be encoded in narrative, in architectural alignment, in oral tradition maintained across generations. Maritime navigation of open ocean does not require metal ships or magnetic compasses. Polynesian navigators crossed the Pacific in wooden canoes using stellar navigation, ocean swell patterns, bird behavior, and other natural signs, with no metal instruments of any kind. If a late Pleistocene society had developed comparable maritime knowledge applied to different oceans, no metal artifacts would necessarily be required. Large-scale stone construction does not require metal tools in the way we often assume. The tools used to construct Stonehenge, or the pyramids, or Göbekli Tepe, were stone, bone, wood, and rope. The Inca, who built extraordinary stone structures including walls with tolerances of fractions of a millimetre between blocks, used no metal cutting tools. The limiting factor in large stone construction is not the cutting tools. It is the social organisation to mobilise the labour, the engineering knowledge to design the structure, and the cultural motivation to complete a project that requires sustained collective effort over long periods. A pre-conventional civilization with late Paleolithic technology could have possessed all of the knowledge required to generate the anomalies we see in later cultures. The question is not whether such knowledge was technologically possible at that level. It clearly was. The question is whether there is enough evidence of such a civilization existing to overcome the prior probability that it did not. That prior probability is not as low as it was 20 years ago. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe has established that sophisticated monumental construction existed earlier than conventionally assumed. The development of ancient DNA analysis has revealed that late Pleistocene human populations were moving around the world with more sophistication than the conventional record suggested. The recognition that the coastal archaeological record is systematically drowned and therefore unavailable has established that the conventional record is more incomplete than previously recognized. The prior probability is shifted, not to certainty or near certainty, but from the near impossibility that characterized mainstream thought 20 years ago to something more like genuine open question. Now let's think about the human dimension of all of this, because behind the maps and the monuments and the genetic signals and the sonar images, there are people. Real people who lived and thought and built and understood things. People whose lives were ended by a catastrophe so complete that almost nothing they knew or did has been preserved in any accessible record. Imagine being part of a maritime society in the late Pleistocene. Your people have been on the ocean for as long as anyone's memory reaches. Your knowledge of the sea is as intimate as the knowledge a farmer has of their land. You know the stars by which you navigate not as abstract points of light but as landmarks that have specific characters, specific behaviours, specific relationships to each other, and to the horizon that change in predictable ways through the year and across latitudes. You know the ocean swells, which carry information about distant weather and distant land. You know the birds which species travel how far from which coasts. Your navigation is not a technology separate from your understanding of the world. It is your understanding of the world. You have charts. Not paper charts, because paper does not exist yet. Perhaps charts carved into bark, or drawn on animal skin, or encoded in patterns of knotted cord. Perhaps charts exist only in memory, held in the minds of the navigators, and transmitted through the system of apprenticeship and demonstration that transfers knowledge in oral cultures. But the knowledge is real. The charts represent real observation of real coastlines, accumulated over generations of navigation. Your people have been to places that other people only hear described. The great southern continent with its cold rocky coasts and its strange animals and its winters of permanent darkness. The western land beyond the great ocean where rivers run from tall mountains to warm coastal plains. The island chains that stretch across the middle of the world. You have been there. Your grandparents' grandparents were there. The knowledge of those places is in your culture, and then, within the span of a generation, everything changes. The cold comes, not gradually, almost overnight in the scale of a human life. The weather becomes violent and unpredictable. The seasonal patterns that your navigation depends on stop working reliably. The ocean that you have known becomes hostile. The coastlines you have navigated change as the sea level shifts, flooding harbours, drowning landmarks, rearranging the geography you have memorised. The communities you have traded with, spread along coastlines that are now disappearing under rising water, stop responding to your outreach. The catastrophe that killed 90% of humanity did not spare maritime peoples. It may have hit them harder than inland people in some respects, because their settlements, concentrated on the coasts, were directly in the path of the sea level rise. Community after community, harbour after harbour, drowning under the advancing ocean while its inhabitants fled inland, died, or managed by some combination of luck and capability to survive. What survived of the knowledge? Some of it, imperfectly, in fragments. The survivors of a maritime civilization, displaced from their coastal homes, carrying knowledge that was no longer fully applicable in a changed world, would have done what survivors always do. They would have tried to find communities that could absorb them, to share what they knew in exchange for the resources they needed to stay alive. And the knowledge they carried, astronomical knowledge, cartographic knowledge, maritime knowledge, would have had value to inland communities rebuilding in the aftermath of the catastrophe. This is one plausible mechanism for the transmission of pre-conventional knowledge into the historical record. Not the survival of a civilization intact, not a secret lineage of keepers of ancient wisdom maintaining an unbroken tradition for 10,000 years, but the ordinary, messy, partial process of survivors integrating into new communities, teaching what they knew, watching some of it persist in modified and imperfect form while most of it was lost, and eventually having some small fraction of it reach the scribes and map makers of historical civilizations, who encoded it in texts and maps that are now anomalous within the conventional framework. This is not a satisfying story. There are no temples of secret knowledge, no hidden records, no dramatic revelations. Just survivors trying to keep themselves and their knowledge alive, succeeding partially, failing mostly, and leaving just enough of a trace that 12,000 years later, researchers find anomalies that they cannot fully explain. The Egyptian priests who told the story of Atlantis to Solon may have been the end of a very long and very imperfect chain of transmission. Each link in that chain was a teacher and a student, a story told around a fire, a technique demonstrated and imperfectly learned, a navigational knowledge encoded in myth because there was no other medium available. By the time it reached the Egyptian temple records, it may have been transformed beyond any possibility of detailed recovery. But the core of it, a great civilization, destroyed in a single catastrophic event, may have been preserved because the event was dramatic enough, the loss complete enough, that it became a defining story for every culture that inherited a fragment of the memory. Now let's ask the hardest question, the one that determines whether we should take the lost civilization hypothesis seriously as a scientific proposition rather than as an interesting story. What would it take to prove it? And what would it take to disprove it? To prove it, we would need physical evidence of a sophisticated pre-conventional civilization that cannot be explained within the conventional framework. Structures with clear evidence of astronomical precision, mathematical understanding, or engineering sophistication that is incompatible with the technological level the conventional framework assigns to 12,000 years ago. Artifacts with characteristics of manufacture that require technologies not otherwise attested at that date. Writing or numerical systems from that period that demonstrate a level of abstract symbolic thinking beyond what the conventional record allows. The difficulty is that the very conditions that would produce such a civilization, coastal location, maritime orientation, pre-Younger Dryas timing, are also the conditions that would most thoroughly erase its physical evidence. The coastal sites are underwater. The organic materials are long since decomposed. The structures, if built of perishable materials as most pre-agricultural structures were, are gone. And the window of time is long enough that even stone structures would have been substantially degraded by 12,000 years of weathering, wave action, biological colonization, and sediment burial. To disprove it, we would need to demonstrate that all of the anomalies, the maps, the astronomical alignments, the genetic signals of unusual population movements, the flood myths, the specific correspondences between the Plato account and what we know about conditions in the late Pleistocene, can be individually explained within the conventional framework without invoking anything extraordinary. And that demonstration would need to be genuinely satisfying rather than merely technically possible. Currently, neither proof nor disproof is available. We're in the uncomfortable position that characterizes the frontier of genuine inquiry rather than settled science. The evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. The conventional explanations are possible but not fully satisfying. And the physical evidence that would resolve the question is, for the most part, at the bottom of the ocean. What this means for how we hold the question is important. Not certainty in either direction, not credulous acceptance of every element of the lost civilization hypothesis, and not defensive dismissal of the anomalies because they're inconvenient for the conventional framework. Instead, something like intellectual honesty about what we know, what we do not know, and what we cannot currently know. The peri-race map is real. The anomaly it presents is real. The standard explanations for that anomaly are possible but not fully satisfying. The same is true for the Oronce Finé map, the Boachi map, the Sphinx weathering anomaly, the astronomical alignments, the genetic signals of unexpected population movements, and the global pattern of flood myths that point to a period of catastrophic flooding at the end of the Ice Age. None of these anomalies, taken alone, requires an extraordinary explanation. Together, they form a pattern that is more demanding of explanation than any individual element, and the pattern points consistently toward the same period, the same event, the same candidate for what was lost. The Younger Dryas catastrophe, 12,000 years ago, which we know destroyed much of what existed before it, may have destroyed more than the archaeological record can show us. Because the archaeological record of that period is catastrophically incomplete. Here is what I keep coming back to. Here is the thing that haunts me about this question more than any specific piece of evidence. We know the Younger Dryas happened. We know it killed most of the people alive at the time. We know that the coastal zones most likely to have supported sophisticated maritime cultures were drowned by the sea level rise that followed. We know that the archaeological record before 10,000 years ago is extremely sparse, far sparser than the population genetic evidence suggests it should be. If all of those people left the kind of inland sites that archaeologists conventionally excavate. We know all of this. It is not disputed. It is established science. And yet when someone suggests that this known catastrophe might have erased a civilization sophisticated enough to leave anomalous traces in later cultures, the response from the mainstream is often to treat the suggestion as obviously wrong, as if the known incompleteness of the record is not a problem, as if the absence of evidence for a coastal civilization when the coast is underwater is evidence of absence. This is not good reasoning. The known gaps in the record are not arguments against the existence of what might fill those gaps. They are arguments for investigating more thoroughly whether anything is there. The investigation is underway slowly. Underwater archaeology is developing tools and methodologies that will eventually allow more systematic investigation of the drowned continental shelves. Ancient DNA analysis is revealing population movements that were previously invisible. The reassessment of anomalous maps and monuments is continuing, with more sophisticated tools and more rigorous methodology than Hapgood was able to bring to the question in 1958. The answers may come. Not in the form of dramatic revelations that vindicate Hancock and overturn conventional archaeology. More likely in the form of gradual accumulation of evidence that slowly shifts the conventional picture. The discovery of underwater structures that are unambiguously artificial, at dates that extend the conventional timeline. The recovery of astronomical knowledge from sites whose dates push back the frontier of sophisticated intellectual culture. The identification of genetic signals that require explanations involving maritime movements not currently accommodated in the conventional framework. Or the evidence may not come. The record may be too thoroughly destroyed. The anomalies may ultimately admit of conventional explanations that we have not yet found. The lost civilization may remain permanently neither proved nor disproved, a question mark at the edge of the record that we can neither answer nor dismiss. That too would be a kind of answer, not the answer we want, but an honest one. What does Atlantis mean? What is the real content of the story? Assuming for a moment that there is real content. It is a story about a sophisticated society that was destroyed by a geological catastrophe at the end of the Ice Age, and whose destruction was so complete that 12,000 years later we are not sure it existed. It is a story about the fragility of civilizational achievement, about how completely a society can be erased by a geological event at the wrong scale and the wrong speed, about how little we would know about ancient Egypt or ancient Rome if those civilizations had been coastal, had depended on maritime infrastructure, and had been drowned by a sea level rise. We are confident that Rome existed because Rome built in stone on high ground and was not drowned. If Rome had been a maritime civilization concentrated on coastal lowlands, and had been destroyed by a 100-meter sea level rise, we would have nothing. No Colosseum, no Forum, no ruins of any kind. Just the anomalous influence of Roman-derived knowledge on the cultures that came after, filtered through imperfect transmission chains, showing up as inexplicable correspondences in medieval manuscripts and as place names in languages that had supposedly never been in contact with Latin. Rome would look like Atlantis looks. This is not an argument that Atlantis was equivalent to Rome, or that any specific lost civilization had Rome's particular character. It is an argument about epistemology, about how we would know if a sophisticated ancient civilization existed and was destroyed, and what the evidence would look like if it did. It would look, in many ways, exactly like the evidence we have: anomalous maps, inexplicable astronomical knowledge, myths about a great civilization destroyed by water, genetic signals of population movements that should not have been possible, isolated monuments showing knowledge that seems to appear from nowhere. It would look like what we see. The search continues, and it continues because human beings are constitutionally incapable of being satisfied with ignorance at the edge of what they know. The maps are in the museums, the anomalies are in the geological record, the myths are in the libraries, the sonar images are in the research archives, and somewhere at the bottom of the ocean, possibly, are the ruins of something that would answer every question. Or possibly nothing at all, just rock and sediment and the ordinary detritus of a sea floor that was never home to anything more than fish. We do not know which. That not knowing is frustrating, and it is also, if you can hold it the right way, beautiful, because it means the question is still alive, the investigation is still possible, the frontier is still there, and somewhere in the world, someone with the right combination of technical skill, funding, luck, and determination is moving toward it, diving into cloudy water with sonar equipment and cameras, extracting sediment cores from ocean floors that have never been sampled, analysing ancient DNA from bones that were dug up decades ago and only now have the technology available to reveal their secrets. The world is still being discovered. After all this time, after all the maps and satellites and deep-sea surveys, there are still things about the human past that we do not know. Still questions that have not been answered. Still the possibility that the next discovery will change everything we thought we understood about where we came from. That possibility is not nothing. It is the specific excitement that comes from standing at the edge of what is known, looking out into what is not, and understanding that the not knowing is not permanent. That the record is incomplete but not sealed, that the evidence is hidden but not destroyed, that the question is unanswered but not unanswerable. Now let's bring the threads together and hold them honestly, not as a believer, not as a dismisser, someone who has looked at the evidence carefully and is trying to say true things about it. Plato wrote about Atlantis in terms that suggest he believed he was reporting historical events transmitted through a specific chain of sources. The account he gives includes details, a date, a location, a description of the catastrophe, that are consistent with what we know about the Younger Dryas and the sea level rise of the deglaciation period. The date Plato gives, 9600 BC, is precisely the transition point of the Younger Dryas, the moment at which the most dramatic climate changes were occurring and the sea level rise was at its most rapid. The Piri Reis map and related cartographic documents from the 15th through 18th centuries show features that correspond to geographical knowledge that was not officially available in those centuries. The most specific and troubling of these features is the apparent depiction of subglacial Antarctic topography on the Piri Reis map. This correspondence has not been definitively explained within the conventional framework. The geological record of the Younger Dryas establishes that a catastrophic climate event occurred approximately 12,900 years ago, that it ended approximately 11,700 years ago, and that during and following this period sea levels rose by sufficient amounts to drown all coastal settlements that had existed along the world's coasts during the lower sea stands of the last ice age. The archaeological record of the period before 10,000 years ago is extremely sparse, far sparser than the genetic evidence of human population size and distribution suggests it should be. The most plausible explanation for this sparsity is that the coastal sites where the largest and most sophisticated populations lived are now underwater. The genetic evidence of ancient DNA analysis shows population movements and relationships in the late Pleistocene that are not fully explained by the conventional framework. Some of these movements require maritime capability that the conventional framework has not historically attributed to late Pleistocene peoples. The global pattern of flood myths, found in over 200 cultures on every inhabited continent, is consistent with a real period of catastrophic flooding at the end of the Ice Age that was experienced by enough human populations in enough locations that it became a defining narrative structure in the cultural memory of peoples around the world. Structures including Göbekli Tepe have established that sophisticated monumental construction, social organization sufficient for large coordinated projects, and symbolic culture sophisticated enough for elaborate artistic programs existed before the conventional timeline of civilization. The ceiling of late Pleistocene human capability is higher than the conventional framework assumed. What do all of these things add up to? They add up to a strong case that the conventional archaeological narrative of human prehistory is significantly incomplete, that the period before 10,000 years ago contained human societies of greater sophistication than the conventional record shows, that a catastrophic event at the Younger Dryas boundary destroyed most of the evidence of what existed before, and that some fragment of the knowledge and memory of what existed before was transmitted through the surviving populations into the historical record, appearing as anomalies in maps, as mythological memories of lost worlds, and as isolated monuments and astronomical knowledge whose origins remain uncertain. Does this mean Atlantis, as Plato described it, existed? Not necessarily in those exact terms. Plato's description is too specific and too literary to be taken as a factual account without question. But the underlying reality that the story encodes, a sophisticated maritime civilization destroyed by the geological catastrophe of the end of the Ice Age, is the most coherent explanation for the pattern of evidence we've examined. Not proved, possibly not provable with the evidence currently available, but more likely than not, and far more likely than the comfortable dismissal that has been the mainstream response for the past century. There is one more thing, one thing that ties this story back to everything we've talked about across these investigations of the deep human past. The Atlantis story is, at its core, a story about forgetting, about what happens when a civilization is destroyed completely enough that its successors do not know it existed, about how the memory of a lost world can persist in distorted, fragmented, transformed form across 12,000 years of transmission without ever quite dying, but also without ever quite being recoverable. Every human culture has stories of a golden age, a time before when things were better, when people lived longer, knew more, were wiser, were closer to the divine. Archaeologists and anthropologists have traditionally interpreted these Golden Age myths as psychological projections, as the expression of nostalgia that is a fundamental feature of human consciousness, rather than as memories of anything real. The Golden Age is always in the past because the past is always better in memory than the present. But what if some of these Golden Age myths are preserving, in transformed form, actual memories of a world that was more sophisticated than what came immediately after it, not golden in the sense of perfect or utopian, but more connected, more accumulated in knowledge, more capable in specific domains than the societies that inherited the fragments of its legacy. The Younger Dryas destroyed most of what had been built. The survivors rebuilt from fragments, and the world that came after, the world of agriculture and cities and writing and civilization as we know it, was built not on the full foundation of what had existed before, but on the small fraction that survived. The golden age that human myths remember may be the golden age that existed before the catastrophe, not perfect, not technologically superior to what came after in all respects, but possessed of knowledge, specifically maritime and astronomical knowledge, that the agricultural civilizations that followed spent millennia trying to reconstruct. Atlantis may be that memory, distorted, mythologized, partially transformed into allegory and partly preserved as history, but at its core the memory of a world that existed before the catastrophe and was erased by it. A world that built things we cannot find because they are at the bottom of the ocean. A world that knew things we can only glimpse in the anomalies of ancient maps. A world that is gone, completely and perhaps permanently gone, but whose echo is still present in the oldest stories human cultures tell about themselves. We came from somewhere. The civilization we have built came from somewhere, and the question of exactly where, of how complete the human story is before 10,000 years ago, is not yet fully answered. The maps at the bottom of the ocean, if they exist, are waiting. The ruins on the drowned continental shelves, if they exist, are waiting. The answers, if they are recoverable, are waiting. And the search continues. Let yourself settle now. The questions are bigger than any single night can answer. The evidence is scattered across the bottom of the ocean and the margins of ancient texts and the encrypted genetics of populations whose ancestors witnessed things we cannot fully reconstruct. The mystery is genuine, the uncertainty is honest, and both the mystery and the uncertainty are part of what makes this story worth sitting with. Think about the people who made the Piri-Reis source maps. Not Piri-Reis himself, who was simply compiling from older sources. The people who originally observed those coastlines, who sailed to the southern continent and returned, who recorded what they saw in some medium that was preserved long enough to find its way. Through chains of copying and transmission we cannot reconstruct, into a 16th century Ottoman admiral's compilation. Who were they? What did they know? What did their world look like? What did they believe about the stars above them and the ocean below them and the great continent at the bottom of the world that they had apparently visited? We do not know, and we may never know. The record is too broken. The catastrophe was too complete. The time is too long. But they were there. The map says they were there. And the map is in the museum in Istanbul, on a piece of gazelle skin, preserved against all probability for 500 years since Piri-Reis drew it, and for however many centuries before that, the source material survived before reaching him. A fragment of a fragment of a fragment, carrying just enough information to tell us that someone, long before the history we know, understood the shape of a world we've only recently mapped ourselves. That is not nothing. It is a hand reaching through the darkness of 12,000 years. And if you look carefully at the strange bottom edge of an old map on a piece of gazelle skin, you can almost see it. The questions will still be there in the morning. The ocean will still have its secrets. And somewhere, under all that water, under all that ice, under all that time, something waits to be found, or not. That uncertainty is not comfortable, but it is honest. And honest uncertainty, held with curiosity rather than anxiety, is the best place to rest when questions are too large for the night. Rest now. The map is not going anywhere. The ocean floor will still be there tomorrow, and the search for what was lost before the record began will continue, as it always has, one anomaly at a time, one piece of gazelle skin at a time, one drowned coastline at a time. Let's go deeper into the specific problem of the Sphinx, because it is the most geographically accessible, the most studied, and in some ways the most instructive of the structural anomalies that bear on the lost civilization question. The Great Sphinx of Giza sits in a depression cut into the limestone bedrock of the Giza Plateau. It faces east toward the rising sun. It is the largest monolithic statue in the world. Its body is approximately 73 meters long and 20 meters high. The face, which has been severely damaged by centuries of deliberate destruction, appears to represent a human being with a headdress. The conventional dating assigns its construction to the reign of the pharaoh Khafre, approximately 4,500 years ago, around 2500 BC. Robert Schoch's argument about the Sphinx weathering is more technically specific than most popular accounts of it convey. He is not simply saying the Sphinx looks old. He is making a specific claim about the depth and pattern of weathering in the vertical walls of the Sphinx enclosure, the pit carved around the statue's body. These walls show deep, undulating, rounded weathering that is characteristic of precipitation erosion, specifically the erosion produced by water flowing down a vertical rock face over long periods. It is a specific weathering signature that geologists can distinguish from wind and sand erosion, which produces a different pattern of horizontal layered damage. The problem is not just that the Sphinx shows precipitation weathering. It is when rainfall intense enough to produce that pattern fell on the Giza Plateau. The plateau is in the eastern Sahara, which is today one of the driest regions on Earth. It was not always this dry. During the African humid period, which lasted approximately from 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, the region received significantly more rainfall, possibly enough rainfall to produce the erosion pattern Schoch observes. Before that, during the late Pleistocene, the region was also wetter, with significant rainfall correlated with the glacial periods. If the Sphinx enclosure weathering is from rainfall during the African humid period, the construction date is pushed back to at least 7,000 BC, which is 2,500 years before the conventional date and before the conventional timeline of Egyptian civilization. If the weathering is from late Pleistocene rainfall, the construction date is pushed back much further, potentially into the Younger Dryas or earlier. Schoch's preferred interpretation is that the original carving of the Sphinx body and enclosure dates to at least 7,000 BC, possibly earlier, and that the head was recarved in dynastic times, potentially refacing an older statue with the features of Khafre. This would explain the visual disproportion between the Sphinx's relatively small head and its large body, which many observers have noted and which Egyptologists attribute to later erosion of the body. The head, being harder to the carver and having been recently recarved, would show less weathering than the body. This interpretation has been disputed by Egyptologists, who argue that the rainfall-induced weathering can be attributed to exceptional flooding events during the dynastic period. that wind erosion can produce patterns similar to what shock describes, and that the circumstantial evidence for Khafra's construction is strong enough to outweigh the geological argument. The debate is real. Shock has responded to each objection in technical detail. His critics have responded to his responses. The argument has been ongoing for more than 30 years and has not been resolved. What is clear is that Shock's argument is not obviously wrong, that it is based on real geological observation rather than wishful thinking, and that the mainstream dismissal of it has sometimes relied more on the authority of conventional dating than on specific geological refutation. The Sphinx may be exactly what the conventional dating says it is. 4,500 years old, built by Khafre, showing precipitation weathering from unusual Nile flooding events or from rainfall during the wetter period of the Old Kingdom. This is possible. It is the conventional position. It has institutional weight behind it. But it is also possible that Shock is right, that the Sphinx, or at least its body and enclosure, is significantly older, that it was already ancient when Khafre recarved the face, that it stands as a monument from a period that the conventional timeline has not accommodated, a period before the catastrophe, before the record. The honest answer is that we do not know, and that the stakes of finding out, if we could find out definitively, would be significant enough to warrant more serious investigation than the controversy has received. There is a specific document that deserves more attention in the Atlantis discussion than it usually receives. Not a map, not a monument, a text, the Oera Linda Book. The Oera Linda Book is a manuscript that appeared in the Netherlands in the 19th century, purporting to be a copy of an ancient Frisian document describing the history of the ancient Frisian people from approximately 2200 BC, back through time to a great catastrophe, which the manuscript describes as a massive flood and earth movement that destroyed a northern land called Atlantis in 2194 BC. The manuscript was immediately controversial. Scholars quickly identified features that suggested it was a forgery from the 19th century, rather than a genuine ancient document. The specific type of paper, the ink, the handwriting style, and several anachronistic elements all pointed to a recent origin. The consensus view is that the Oera Linda Book is a 19th century fabrication, probably created by Cornelis over de Linden or members of his family, and is not a genuine ancient text. This mainstream conclusion is almost certainly correct. The Oera Linda Book is very probably a forgery. But here is why it is interesting in the context of this discussion. The forger, whoever they were, chose to construct a document describing a lost northern civilization destroyed by catastrophic flooding in the early 2nd millennium BC. The story they told, whether drawn from genuine ancient sources or constructed from imagination, shares structural features with the Plato account and with the global flood myth tradition. A sophisticated society, a catastrophic destruction, a small surviving remnant who preserve the knowledge, a tradition of memory transmission that eventually reaches the historical record. The structural recurrence of this story across forgeries, across genuine ancient texts, across the mythological traditions of cultures that had no documented contact with each other, is itself a data point. Not about any specific historical event, but about the deep architecture of human cultural memory, about what kinds of stories human cultures find worth preserving, worth embellishing, worth constructing from scratch if the originals are lost. A great civilization destroyed by water, the survivors carrying forward what they could, the memory passed down through generations. This is the story we return to compulsively across every culture, in every medium. There is something in this structure that resonates at a level deeper than any specific historical event. It is the story of loss and survival and transmission. The story of what it means to remember something that most people have forgotten. The story of a world that ended and a world that was built from the pieces. Whether or not the specific geography of Plato's Atlantis is accurately recorded, whether or not the Piri-Reis map reflects genuine ancient knowledge of Antarctic coastlines, whether or not the Sphinx is 12,000 years old, the story endures, the story of a civilization that was lost, that was great enough to be worth remembering, and that left just enough of a trace that 12,000 years later we're still arguing about where it was. That persistence is itself significant, not as evidence for any specific historical claim, but as evidence for something about human memory, about what we choose to hold on to across the generations, about what we refuse to let go of even when we can no longer clearly see what we are holding. There is a mathematical argument for the existence of pre-conventional maritime civilization that rarely gets the attention it deserves. It is not a dramatic argument. It does not involve anomalous maps or weathered monuments or ancient texts. It involves probability and the simple logic of what we would expect to find. Human beings have been behaviourally modern for at least 50,000 years. The anatomical and cognitive capacity for sophisticated technological and intellectual culture has existed for at least that long. In 50,000 years, what is the probability that sophisticated maritime exploration was attempted, developed, achieved, and then lost at least once before the conventional history of seafaring? This is not a rhetorical question. It is a genuine probability question, and the answer depends on your prior assumptions about the difficulty of maritime technology and the frequency with which it is independently developed. We know that maritime capability capable of crossing significant open water gaps was achieved at least 65,000 years ago, when humans first reached Australia. That crossing required boats and the navigation skills to use them across at least a short stretch of open ocean. We know that by approximately 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, humans were in the Americas, with some genetic evidence suggesting Pacific coastal maritime routes were involved. We know that Polynesian navigators developed open ocean navigation independently, without metal instruments, and achieved extraordinary range and precision with it. We know that the Austronesian expansion, which spread people from Taiwan across the Pacific to Madagascar, was one of the most geographically ambitious maritime ventures in human history, achieved before the conventional timeline of sophisticated navigation. Given all of this, the prior probability that sophisticated maritime exploration, including potentially the charting of major ocean coastlines, was achieved and then lost at some point in the 50,000 years of behaviourally modern human existence is not low. It may be quite high. Maritime technology is not uniquely difficult in the way that, say, metallurgy is, which requires specific geological knowledge. It requires observation, trial and error, social organisation for extended voyages, and the motivation to go beyond the horizon. The Polynesian case shows that societies without metal tools, without writing, without any of the technologies we associate with civilization, can develop extraordinary maritime capability through the accumulation of observational knowledge over generations. The same process applied in the late Pleistocene could have produced capable maritime societies in any of the coastal regions of the world. The question is not whether such societies could have existed. The question is whether they did, and whether any trace of their existence has reached us through the anomalies we've been discussing. The probability argument does not answer that question, but it establishes that the possibility should not be dismissed as inherently improbable. given 50,000 years and the demonstrably achievable technology level of late Pleistocene humans, sophisticated maritime exploration is exactly what we would expect to have happened. The absence of such exploration in the conventional record is not compelling evidence that it did not occur. It is compelling evidence that the conventional record is incomplete. I want to check in with you, wherever you are in the world, however late it is, whatever brought you to this particular story tonight. The questions in this video are genuinely open. I am not trying to convince you that Atlantis existed. I am not trying to convince you that it did not. I am trying to show you the honest shape of what we know and what we do not know, and to let that honest shape be interesting in its own right. If you are finding it interesting, if this is helping you settle in, maybe subscribe, leave a comment, tell me what time it is where you are, and let's continue. Let's talk about what happened to the memory, about the specific mechanisms by which knowledge from a destroyed civilization might have entered the historical record in the form we see it. The most important mechanism is what anthropologists call diffusion, the spread of cultural traits, technologies, and knowledge from one group to another through contact, trade, marriage, and migration. Diffusion is the normal process by which human knowledge spreads across populations. It does not require anything dramatic. It does not require a dedicated lineage of knowledge keepers maintaining secret archives. It requires only that groups in contact with each other share information in the ordinary ways that groups in contact always do. If the survivors of a pre-conventional maritime civilization were scattered by the Younger Dryas catastrophe into the populations of the inland peoples who were rebuilding in the aftermath, their knowledge would have entered those populations through diffusion. Not all at once, not completely, but gradually, imperfectly, in fragments that were adopted and modified and partially lost and partially preserved as the absorbing cultures found them useful or interesting. The astronomical knowledge that appears, apparently from nowhere, in early historical civilizations may be one example. The oldest astronomical records we have from Egypt and Mesopotamia show a level of understanding of celestial cycles that implies a long prior period of systematic observation and recording that predates the written records we have. The Mesopotamian knowledge of the precession of the equinoxes, a cycle of 26,000 years that requires centuries of careful observation to detect, appears in the historical record without an obvious developmental history behind it. It is there, already understood, already incorporated into the cosmological framework of the earliest literate civilizations. Where did it come from? The conventional answer is that it was developed during a long oral tradition of astronomical observation before writing was invented, and that the writing simply captured knowledge that had already been developed. This is possible. But it is also possible that the knowledge was transmitted from a tradition that had been recording astronomical observations since before the Younger Dryas, using methods of record-keeping that did not survive in recognizable form. The mathematical knowledge embedded in ancient monuments is a similar puzzle. The Great Pyramid incorporates mathematical constants, including pi and phi, the golden ratio in its proportions, with a precision that has been extensively documented and extensively disputed. Whether the incorporation is intentional or coincidental is a genuine debate. But the debate itself is revealing. The possibility that the builders of the Great Pyramid 4,500 years ago had mathematical knowledge that was not again formally articulated until ancient Greece has enough evidence behind it to be worth debating. Where did that knowledge come from? The conventional answer is that it developed gradually in Egypt, building on practical experience of surveying and construction. This is possible, but it is also consistent with the tradition of transmitted mathematical knowledge that was older than the monuments in which it is expressed. The diffusion mechanism does not require the transmitted knowledge to have arrived in Egypt all at once or from a single source. It could have arrived in fragments, from multiple directions, over multiple generations, as survivors and descendants of survivors moved through the populations of the ancient world and left fragments of what they knew wherever they went. The knowledge that reached the builders of the Great Pyramid may have been the end product of 10,000 years of partial transmission, each step losing something and modifying something, but preserving enough that the original sophisticated tradition is still dimly recognizable in what arrived. This is speculative. It is necessarily speculative because the chain of transmission is not documented in any form we have access to. But it is not implausible, and it is the kind of speculation that the evidence actually warrants, as distinct from the kind that it does not. Let's consider the underwater ruins question one more time from a different angle, not from the perspective of specific sites that have been identified and debated, but from the perspective of what we know is there that has not been investigated. The continental shelves of the world contain approximately 27 million square kilometres of sea floor that was dry land during the last ice age. 27 million square kilometres. That is larger than the entire continent of North America. Every square kilometre of it was potentially inhabited during the period of lower sea level. Given that coastal environments are among the most productive and densely inhabited in the world, a significant fraction of that 27 million square kilometres was almost certainly inhabited. In 27 million square kilometres of formerly inhabited coastal land, now underwater, how many archaeological sites exist? The answer, based on the density of archaeological sites in comparable coastal environments that are currently above water, is probably in the millions. Many of them would be small campsites, fire pits, middens, but some of them, concentrated in the areas where conditions for settlement were best, would represent the most sophisticated settlements of the late Pleistocene. The places where populations were densest, where cultural complexity was highest, where the accumulated knowledge of generations was concentrated. None of this has been systematically investigated. A handful of sites have been identified by chance, through fishing nets that occasionally drag up ancient artifacts, through sonar surveys conducted for other purposes, through the efforts of individual researchers pursuing specific leads. But the systematic underwater archaeology of the drowned continental shelves, the kind of investigation that would actually tell us what is down there, has not been done and is not currently underway at any meaningful scale. The reason is resources. Underwater archaeology is expensive, difficult, and technically demanding in ways that exceed land archaeology by orders of magnitude. The funding priorities of the archaeological community have not placed the investigation of drowned Pleistocene sites at the top of the list, and the academic infrastructure, the careers and institutions and research programs built around the conventional timeline, has not historically been motivated to look for evidence that would dramatically complicate that timeline. This is not conspiracy. It is the ordinary operation of institutional priorities and resource allocation in a field with more research questions than funding. But it means that the question of what is on the drowned continental shelves is not answered. It is unanswered because we have not looked, Not because we've looked and found nothing. The looking is beginning, slowly. Individual researchers, sometimes working with limited funding, are developing methodologies for identifying and investigating potential sites on the continental shelves. Drone technology is beginning to make underwater survey more affordable. Advances in sonar resolution are making it possible to identify smaller and less obvious features on the sea floor. The investigation of drowned Pleistocene landscapes is an emerging field, driven partly by the growing recognition that the conventional archaeological record is systematically biased toward inland sites. What will it find? Nobody knows. It may find exactly what you would expect: scattered campsites, shell middens, occasional stone tools, the ordinary remains of ordinary hunter-gatherer populations living ordinary hunter-gatherer lives. Or it may find something that requires a more dramatic revision of the picture. The only way to know is to look. There is one specific piece of evidence that I want to spend some time with before we move toward the conclusion. It is a piece of evidence that I find both compelling and underappreciated, and that connects the Atlantis question to the broader story of the Younger Dryas catastrophe that we explored in depth in a previous investigation. Göbekli Tepe, which we discussed at length in the context of the Younger Dryas survivors, is relevant to the Atlantis question in a specific way that goes beyond its general significance as evidence of pre-conventional sophistication. Göbekli Tepe is located in the region that Plato describes as the general area from which Atlantean civilization expanded. The Fertile Crescent, the broader arc of the ancient Near East that includes southeastern Turkey, corresponds to the region Plato describes as the area that Atlantean civilization controlled before the catastrophe. This is not a precise geographical identification. Plato places Atlantis in the Atlantic, not in Turkey. But the broader cultural context, the sophisticated late Pleistocene culture of the Fertile Crescent region, is the right culture in the right place at the right time to have been the source of the kind of knowledge that the Atlantis account describes. More specifically, the astronomical encoding that some researchers have identified at Göbekli Tepe connects it to the astronomical knowledge theme that runs through the Atlantis question. Andrew Collins and others have argued that the layout of Göbekli Tepe's enclosures encodes astronomical alignments, specifically alignments to the rising of specific stars in specific positions at specific dates. If this analysis is correct, the builders of Göbekli Tepe had sophisticated astronomical knowledge encoded in the architecture of their monument at a date that is precisely the transition point between the Younger Dryas and the early Holocene, precisely the date that Plato assigns to the destruction of Atlantis. The connection between Göbekli Tepe and the Atlantis tradition may be indirect. Göbekli Tepe may not be a remnant of Atlantis in any literal sense, but it may be a remnant of the same cultural tradition that Plato's account, filtered through thousands of years of transmission, is trying to describe: the sophisticated, astronomically oriented, maritime-adjacent culture of the late Pleistocene Fertile Crescent, destroyed by the Younger Dryas catastrophe, and leaving only fragments of itself in the monuments and the myths and the anomalous maps that have come down to us. This is speculative, but it is the kind of speculation that is generated by evidence rather than by wishful thinking. The evidence is Göbekli Tepe, the Piri Reis map, the Plato account, the astronomical alignments, the genetic signals, and the global flood myths. The speculation is the interpretation that tries to make sense of all of them together rather than in isolation. and the interpretation that makes the most sense of all of them together is some version of the lost civilization hypothesis. Not necessarily the version that Hancock describes in its details, not necessarily Atlantis exactly as Plato describes it, but something, some cultural tradition more sophisticated than the conventional timeline allows, destroyed by the Younger Dryas catastrophe, leaving fragments of itself scattered through the evidence of cultures that came after. Something about this question is worth sitting with beyond the specific evidence and the specific arguments. Something about what it means that we might not know our own origins, that the story of where civilization came from might be significantly more complex than the account we have constructed from the available evidence. Human beings are creatures of narrative. We need our past to make sense of our present. We need to know where we came from to understand who we are and where we might be going. The conventional narrative of civilization, agriculture developing gradually from hunter-gatherer roots, in the Fertile Crescent starting around 10,000 years ago, cities emerging 5,000 years ago, writing, enabling the accumulation of knowledge that we've been building on ever since, is a coherent and meaningful story. It gives civilization a comprehensible origin, a traceable trajectory, a sense of cumulative progress that grounds our understanding of the present. If the lost civilization hypothesis is correct, in some version, that narrative is incomplete. The origin is older, more complex and more catastrophically disrupted than we have understood. The roots of civilization extend back through a catastrophe that we have only recently begun to understand the scale of. And what we think of as the beginning of civilization is actually a reconstruction, a rebuilding, from fragments of something that came before. That is a different story, not a worse story, but a more complicated one. One that places our current moment in a longer and darker sequence of events. One that asks us to hold our civilizational achievements with some humility, knowing that something sophisticated existed before and was entirely erased. Knowing that the permanence we tend to attribute to the things we build is not guaranteed by anything other than the absence of catastrophes at the wrong scale and the wrong speed. We build on a foundation that includes gaps we cannot see into. That is uncomfortable, but it is also honest. And the honest version of our own history is always more interesting than the comfortable version, even when it is less reassuring. The ocean keeps its secrets. The ice keeps its secrets. The anomalous maps in the museums of the world keep their secrets. And the question of where civilization really began, of how old the roots of human sophistication actually are, of what was lost before the record started, remains genuinely open. That openness is not a failure. It is an invitation to investigate more carefully, to look in the places we have not looked, to take the anomalies seriously enough to pursue them with the rigor they deserve, to be willing to be surprised by what the evidence shows when we look at it without the filter of the conventional timeline we've inherited. The map on the gazelle skin is waiting in Istanbul. The ruins on the continental shelves are waiting under the ocean. The answers to the oldest questions about where we came from are waiting to be found, or not found. But either way, the search is the most important thing we can do with the questions. Rest now. The Atlantis question does not need to be resolved tonight. It has waited 12,000 years. It can wait until morning. And when you wake, the ocean will still be there. The map will still be there. The anomalies will still be there. And somewhere, under all that water, something waits to either confirm or finally put to rest the oldest story human civilization tells about itself. There is one geographical candidate for the location of Atlantis that has received considerable attention in recent years, and that deserves a serious, balanced examination. It is not in the Atlantic Ocean, where Plato places it. It is in the Sahara Desert, which is as far from the Atlantic as you can get while still being on the same continent. And yet the correspondence between the physical geography of the site and the physical description in Plato's account is striking enough that it cannot simply be dismissed. The Richat Structure is a geological formation in the Saharan region of what is now Mauritania in West Africa. From the air, it is one of the most dramatic and unmistakable features of the Saharan landscape. It consists of a series of concentric rings of rock, alternating ridges and valleys, centered on a roughly circular central dome. The overall diameter of the structure is approximately 40 kilometers. From above, it looks like a target, or like the rings of a tree, or like the aerial view of a planned circular city. The Richat structure was identified and named in the 1960s after the first satellite photographs of the Sahara revealed its extraordinary shape. Geologists quickly recognized it as a geological formation, specifically an eroded dome of ancient rock that had been pushed upward by a volcanic intrusion and then sculpted by hundreds of millions of years of erosion into its current circular pattern. It is not a crater. It is not a man-made structure. It is a completely natural geological formation that has been studied extensively and whose origin is well understood. But the visual correspondence to Plato's description of Atlantis is remarkable. Plato describes Atlantis as having a central hill surrounded by concentric alternating rings of water and land. The Richat structure has concentric alternating rings of ridges and valleys that could correspond to this description if interpreted differently. The outer diameter of approximately 40 kilometers corresponds roughly to the dimensions Plato describes if you take his numbers literally rather than as approximations. The structural correspondence is the most interesting part. Plato's account specifies that the central island of Atlantis was ringed by 2 rings of land and 3 rings of water, with the outermost ring of water being connected to the sea by a channel. The Richat structure has concentric rings of alternating rock and lower terrain that could, with some interpretation, correspond to this pattern. The central dome of the Richat structure is surrounded by concentric rings of resistant quartzite, which forms the ridges, separated by zones of more easily eroded sedimentary rock, which would correspond to the lowland or water-bearing zones. The most compelling version of the Richat structure hypothesis, developed by researchers including Randall Carlson and the popular YouTube channel Bright Insight, which brought significant attention to the site, argues that the Richat structure was the centre of the Atlantean capital city during a period when the Sahara was habitable. During the African humid period, which we know from geological evidence lasted from approximately 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, the Sahara received substantial rainfall. Lake beds, river channels, and fossil evidence of hippos and crocodiles and other water-dependent animals in the modern Saharan desert establish beyond doubt that the region was significantly wetter during this period than it is today. During the African humid period, the Richat structure would have been in a habitable region with water available. The rings of the structure would have been suitable for the kind of circular city planning that Plato describes, and the location in what is now Mauritania, in northwestern Africa, is not impossibly far from the Atlantic coast, which Plato's account requires Atlantis to be near. The hypothesis has significant problems. The most serious is the elevation. The Richat Structure is located approximately 400 meters above sea level. Plato's account describes Atlantis as an island, or near island, accessible from the ocean, which would require it to be at or very near sea level, not 400 meters above it. The supporters of the Richat Structure hypothesis argue that the sea level during the relevant period was different enough, or that the land elevation has changed to make this work, but neither argument is geologically convincing. The second problem is the date. If the Richat Structure was the site of Atlantis during the African humid period, the relevant dates are between 11,000 and 5,000 years ago, which overlaps only partially with the date Plato gives of 9,600 BC. The African humid period began at approximately the right time, which aligns with Plato, but the geological evidence for the Richat Structure as a habitation site does not extend back to the specific date Plato identifies. The third problem is the lack of archaeological evidence. The Richat Structure has been visited and examined, and no archaeological remains consistent with the kind of sophisticated urban civilization Plato describes have been found. This is not definitive, given that the structure is in a remote desert region that has not been comprehensively excavated, but it is the kind of absence of evidence that, in this specific case, should be weighed. The Richat Structure is an interesting candidate. The visual correspondence is real. The circumstance of the African humid period making the region habitable at the right time is real. But the hypothesis has enough problems that it should be treated as a speculative suggestion rather than as a serious identification of the specific site. What the Richat Structure discussion illustrates is the difficulty of the identification problem. Every candidate location for Atlantis has significant problems when examined carefully. The Atlantic Ocean itself, Plato's stated location, contains no island of the size he describes, which is larger than Libya and Asia combined, and never did within the geological period relevant to human habitation. The Mediterranean has been proposed, with specific candidates including the island of Thera, which was destroyed by a volcanic eruption around 1628 BC. But the Thera eruption, while catastrophic, is too recent and too small to match Plato's account in its key details. The honest answer is that we do not know where Atlantis was, if it was anywhere specific at all. We do not know whether Plato's account refers to a single place and a single event, or is a composite memory of multiple events and locations synthesized into one narrative. We do not know whether the details Plato gives, the size, the location, the specific political and architectural features, reflect genuine ancient memory or literary embellishment of a kernel of historical reality. The location question may be permanently unanswerable, and that is frustrating but not devastating, because the most important question about Atlantis is not where it was. The most important question is whether anything like it existed, whether there was a sophisticated maritime culture prior to the conventional timeline of civilization that was destroyed by the Younger Dryas catastrophe, and whose influence can be detected in the anomalies of later cultures. That question, unlike the location question, may eventually be answerable through the investigation of drowned continental shells, through the analysis of ancient DNA, through the careful study of anomalous maps and monuments with rigorous rather than dismissive methodology, through the development of a scientific framework that is genuinely open to the possibility that the conventional timeline is incomplete, rather than defensively committed to preserving it. The Egyptian connection to this story deserves more attention than it usually receives in popular treatments of the Atlantis question. Not Egypt as the home of pyramids and pharaohs, though that is part of it, but Egypt as the specific culture in which, according to Plato, the memory of Atlantis was preserved in the form that reached us. The priests of Sais, who told the story to Solon in the 6th century BC, were the custodians of one of the most ancient continuous religious and cultural traditions in the ancient world. The temple at Sais was dedicated to the goddess Neith, one of the oldest deities in the Egyptian pantheon, whose worship predated the historical period and whose association with wisdom, war and creation makes her one of the most primal figures in Egyptian religion. The priests who maintained the Sais temple in Solon's time were inheritors of a tradition that extended back, by their own account, to the most ancient periods of Egyptian civilization. The dynastic period, which the conventional timeline begins around 3100 BC, was not the beginning of that tradition. It was, in the Egyptian understanding, a relatively recent expression of a civilization whose roots extended much further back. The Egyptian concept of time was not linear in the way that modern Western historiography is. It was cyclical. The current age was one of many. Previous ages had existed, had reached sophistication, and had been destroyed or declined before the current cycle began. This cyclical understanding of history, which is found in various forms in many ancient cultures, is often interpreted by modern scholars as mythological thinking, as a failure to understand history in the correct, linear, progressive terms. But it may also encode a genuine memory of something real, a memory of previous periods of cultural sophistication, separated from the present by catastrophes that reset the cycle. The Egyptian concept of Zep Tepi, the first time, refers to a primordial age of the gods when the world was new and the beings who shaped Egyptian civilization first established its institutions and knowledge. The first time is not dated precisely in the conventional sense, but the astronomical and mythological evidence that some researchers have found embedded in the layout of Egyptian monuments suggests that the first time corresponds approximately to the period of 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, the period of the Younger Dryas and its immediate aftermath. The Sphinx faces east. In the conventional dating, it was built around 2500 BC, facing the rising sun at the vernal equinox as it appeared at that date. But due to the precession of the equinoxes, the constellation rising at the vernal equinox changes over the 26,000-year precessional cycle. At approximately 10,500 years ago, at the vernal equinox, the constellation Leo was rising directly in the east. The Sphinx, as a lion-headed monument, may be facing the celestial lion of its own time, the age of Leo as marked by the precession. This interpretation, associated primarily with John Anthony West and Robert Schoch and Graham Hancock, is disputed. But the astronomical calculation is mathematically correct. The precession is real. The age of Leo did coincide with the period around 10,500 years ago. The question of whether the alignment of the Sphinx to the rising of Leo at that date is intentional or coincidental is a genuine question, not one that can be dismissed without examination. If the Sphinx was oriented to the rising of Leo in its own age, it was built to speak to a time that the conventional dating assigns to 4,000 years before the Sphinx's construction. Either the builders were recording knowledge of an age that preceded them, preserved through this kind of transmission chain we have been discussing, or the alignment is coincidental and the interpretation is wishful thinking. Determining which of these is the case requires more rigorous investigation than the conventional dismissal provides. The Egyptian tradition holds that the god Thoth, associated with wisdom and writing and the recording of knowledge, came to Egypt in a remote period and established the foundations of Egyptian civilization. Thoth is specifically associated with the recording and preservation of ancient knowledge, with the establishment of temples and libraries in which the accumulated wisdom of previous ages was kept. The Greek historian Herodotus, visiting Egypt in the 5th century BC, was told by Egyptian priests that Egypt had existed for much longer than the Greek civilization, that the records in the temples extended back to a time before the Greek world had been established. These traditions may be mythological. They may reflect the ordinary human tendency to imagine the past as more ancient and more sophisticated than the evidence shows. But they may also reflect a genuine memory of a tradition of knowledge preservation that extends back further than the dynastic period, a tradition of collecting and maintaining knowledge from older sources that was begun, perhaps, by exactly the kind of survivors we have been discussing throughout this investigation. The Library of Alexandria, which was the greatest repository of ancient knowledge in the ancient world before its destruction, may have been the latest expression of a tradition of knowledge preservation that began much earlier. Not in Alexandria, not in the dynastic period, but in the impulse, visible at Göbekli Tepe and in the Egyptian priests' claim to ancient records, to collect and preserve the knowledge of what has come before against the possibility that the world will end again. The world did end, more than once, and each time some fragment of what had been built was saved, imperfectly, partially, in forms that were distorted by the process of transmission and by the cultural context in which the transmission occurred, but saved enough that the thread was not entirely broken. We are at the end of that thread, and the question of what was at the beginning, of how far back the roots of human intellectual culture actually extend, of how much was lost and how much was preserved, is still open. Let us think for a moment about what it would mean to actually find it, not what it would prove academically, what it would mean, what it would do to the story we tell about ourselves. Human civilization, as we understand it, is approximately 12,000 years old. That is our timeline. From the first agricultural villages to the first cities to the empires and the philosophies and the sciences and the technologies that have accumulated to produce the world we inhabit tonight. 12,000 years. That is a long time in human terms, long enough to contain everything we know as history, long enough that the beginning of it feels impossibly remote. But if there was a civilization before that, sophisticated enough to chart the world, sophisticated enough that fragments of its knowledge survived the catastrophe and filtered through into the cultures that came after, then our 12,000 years is not the whole story. It is the last chapter of a story that began earlier, a story whose earlier chapters were destroyed so thoroughly that we cannot read them directly, only infer their existence from the anomalies they left behind in the chapters we do have. This would change something fundamental about how we understand our place in time. Not the facts of history as we currently know them. Those would remain. The pyramids would still be 4,500 years old. The Mesopotamian cities would still be 5,000 years old. The agricultural revolution would still have occurred in the Fertile Crescent 10,000 years ago. But the context in which all of these developments occurred would be different. they would be understood not as the beginning of civilization, but as the recovery of civilization, as the rebuilding from fragments of something that existed before and was destroyed. This is not a comfortable reframing. It implies that we are not the culmination of a progressive story of development from simple to complex, from primitive to sophisticated. We are somewhere in the middle of a much longer story, and we do not know how many times the cycle has turned before us. We do not know how much was built and lost before the record we have begins. We do not know whether the knowledge and capability that existed in the best of the pre-Younger Dryas world exceeded, in certain domains, what we have rebuilt since. That uncertainty should produce humility rather than despair, not the paralytic humility of people who feel overwhelmed by what they do not know, but the generative humility of people who understand that the story is not finished, that the record is not complete, that there are questions still to be answered and evidence still to be found. The technology to answer some of those questions is now within reach, not the distant future, not a hypothetical capability. Technologies that exist now or that are being developed right now make it possible to investigate the drowned continental shelves in ways that were not possible even 20 years ago. Autonomous underwater vehicles can survey large areas of seafloor in detail that was previously achievable only at great expense. Side-scan sonar can identify features on the seafloor that might be artificial structures. Sub-bottom profilers can reveal what lies beneath the sediment surface. DNA analysis of sediment cores can tell us what species of plants and animals lived at a site before it was drowned. The investigation of the Doggerland seafloor is already underway in a serious way. British and Dutch researchers have been systematically mapping the submerged landscape of the North Sea using sonar and sediment coring, and they have found evidence of the rich habitation of the region during the Pleistocene. The bones of mammoths and aurochs, stone tools, organic material from ancient campsites, none of it revolutionary by itself, but collectively building a picture of the drowned landscape that confirms it was densely inhabited and ecologically rich. Similar investigations are beginning in other drowned landscape regions, the Sunda Shelf of Southeast Asia, the shelf areas of the Indian subcontinent, the coastal regions of Australia, whose Aboriginal inhabitants have maintained oral traditions that describe the flooding of the coastal lands in terms consistent with the sea level rise of the deglaciation. These traditions are now being taken seriously by geologists and archaeologists as possible records of real events transmitted through a remarkable continuity of oral culture across thousands of years. The answers are coming, slowly, imperfectly, not as dramatic revelations but as gradual accumulations of evidence that, piece by piece, will fill in the picture of what the pre-conventional world actually contained. Whether that picture will include something that clearly warrants the description civilization in the full sense remains to be seen. But the investigation is underway, the tools are improving, and the academic culture, slowly and reluctantly, is becoming more open to the possibility that the conventional timeline is a floor rather than a ceiling. The map on the gazelle skin has been waiting 500 years since Piri Reis drew it. The question it poses has been waiting 12,000 years since whatever event generated the knowledge that found its way into it. A little more patience seems warranted. The ocean is vast. The truth, wherever it lies, is patient. Let the question settle gently around you. You do not need to resolve the Atlantis question tonight, Nobody has resolved it in 12,000 years, which suggests tonight is probably not when it will happen. What you can carry with you is the honest shape of the mystery. The Piri-Reis map is real. Its anomalies are real. The Plato account was written in good faith by one of the greatest minds of the ancient world, drawing on a source he believed was historical. The geological evidence for the Younger Dryas catastrophe is solid. The sea level rise that drowned the continental shelves is established. The systematic incompleteness of the pre-conventional archaeological record is acknowledged. From all of that, what we can say with confidence is this: the story of where civilization came from is not finished being told. The conventional account is the best account we have from the evidence available in the places where we have looked. But the places where we have not looked, the bottom of the ocean, the drowned continental shelves, the subglacial topography of Antarctica, contain evidence whose nature we do not know. Somewhere in that unexamined evidence, the answer to the Atlantis question may exist. A structure that resolves the debate in one direction or the other. A site that is unambiguously artificial and unambiguously ancient enough to require a revision of the conventional timeline. Or nothing. Nothing but rock and sediment and the ordinary quiet of a sea floor that has never known a city. We will find out, or we will not. The ocean keeps its own counsel. The ice keeps its own counsel. The ancient parchment in the museum in Istanbul keeps its own counsel, showing its strange coastline to everyone who looks and refusing to explain where that information came from. The mystery endures, and mysteries, held with curiosity rather than anxiety, are among the most comfortable things to rest with at the end of a long day. The map is in the museum, the questions are in the air, and the search, wherever it leads, continues. Sleep well.